Hello, everybody. I'm Susanna Gaunt, and I'm here down at the Duluth Art Institute's Morrison Gallery for my exhibit Integument. And this is the second of my live streams surrounded around the event. And today I'm going to focus specifically on sewing a seed pod, which is part of my larger piece called Disperse, which is a collection of over 300 seeds. They look something like this, that are laid out on the floor here in the gallery space, but also I think are open to many different ways of being displayed. So I'll tell you a little bit about them and then go through the process, but most of the time here during the live stream, I want to focus on actually making one of the seed pods so you can see how that is, and also maybe just zone out as I sew as a way to kind of deal with today's big news and big events that are happening surrounding the election. So what these seed pods are is there's a photograph on one side and there is text on the other side. And the photograph is an image that I've taken either of the natural world or even of the man-made world that is sort of like a moment in time or a glimpse of an experience that I've had or just something that I've seen and wanted to take note of in my mind, usually because I either find joy or wonder in what I've seen, or I find humor in what I've seen. And so that's a way to capture those moments and collect them. And that collection, of course, is turned into a large pile of seeds, kind of what I call my seed bank at this point. On the other side is a word, which I think might be backwards for you. So that'll be your trick for today, or your game for today, is trying to figure out what it says. Each word is started mostly with, started mostly with the word gift, the idea of a gift given to you in nature, a moment. And from there, just riffed on to different words that were interesting to me or I thought might connect to the photographs that I was taking. As I said, there's over 300 seeds, so it takes, the thesaurus only gets you so far with one single word. And so very quickly moved on to other actions that had happened in nature, things that animals do, things that plants do. But I also played around with what different terms like architectural terms throughout the different words that I used. So the first step in the process is to photograph, and then I download those all on the computer. And the next step is to find the words that I want to go with the different photographs. The photographs are printed. This is a sheet that was obviously used to cut out some of the seeds. Photographs are printed on a paper that's called Pictorico. It's semi-translucent, has a really good quality to it. If you've seen earlier work of mine and saw the tags that were hanging called inventory, those were also on Pictorico. And then I use a Cricut machine. Those are those die cutter machines to put the words into, I put them in the computer and I have them cut through the Cricut machine. I decided to use a Cricut machine because doing, well, for one, 300 different seeds hand cut would be quite difficult, but also my hands just aren't as the same quality as what a Cricut machine could do. And then as you can see, I cut the two sides out. You've got the two layers that I cut out, and I cut them together using a template so that I can have a sense of getting them to be pretty much exactly the same size. And then also, I found that if I did it freehand, it never ended up looking like a seed. So I definitely find that I use these templates for making these seeds. So once I have my two sides, I've I've got my text side, which if I turn it over, you'll actually be able to read the text, and my photograph side. The next step is I'm going to put them together, and I'm going to pre-pin the holes that I sew into. I find that really useful because, well, for a lot of reasons, partly because it's dimensional when I'm actually doing it, but also so that I don't have to make sure that it's lined up while I'm sewing. It's all been done ahead of time, and so that's something that I do. Also, working with these materials, they both are a plastic, not a paper per se, and so they're a little harder to get through. And so if I had to push through every single time to make the holes for the sewing, that would be a little bit more difficult to do. All right, so I actually skipped a step. I'm going to tell you real quick. When I use this paper here, which is called Duralar, I draw out using the template. And so the first thing I have to do actually is erase my pencil marks. So I'm going to actually tip the screen down so that you guys can see my hands a little bit better. Just at first wanted you to be able to see some of the show in the background, including some seeds right down there. And so I'm going to go ahead and tip this down so that you guys can see what I'm doing. And sorry, I noticed here the table is shaking a little bit, so that means the screen is shaking. Same thing happens when I do this at home and my kids are doing homework. But after the erasing, I don't think we'll have much shaking. All right, that one wasn't too bad. Looks pretty clean. So now I'm just gonna line it up as best I can. And I just use a piece of foam core basically to catch the pin marks. You can see this one has been used a lot. And handy dandy thimble. I actually had pre-done these already, so it sits on my foam core, and I'm seeing I have a little more eraser marks. Sometimes they're hard to see until they're up against something dark. And now I make all my little pinholes, which if you look a little bit at this piece here, you can see where all the thread goes through. So that's about the distance that I pin my holes. You could, go through and be real methodical and actually measure all those holes if you wanted, but I don't. I kind of like the idea of them being a little bit more messy or a little bit more arbitrary than that. And so here we go. All right, one side is about done. So when I'm developing work for a series like this, series of seeds, I sometimes will look or often look for something that can become sort of a production line. I don't know what it is that makes me like to do that, but I do like the monotony of it to a point, and I like the idea that I can produce multiples of something that all go through the same steps. Part of it might be that making art can take a lot of creative energy, and obviously that's one of the reasons that artists get involved in making art and love making art. But sometimes it's also nice to just zone out and be able to have already made some of the decisions for a body of work or a piece of art, and then just go through the motions, go through the assembly line. So this seed piece is definitely a lot like that for me. So all my holes are poked through, but then as you can tell, the seed is still kind of flat, so or still very flat. So the next step is actually to create the seam that will give dimension to each side of the seed. So when it's sitting here pinned down, usually what I do, and I've pre-done this, but what I do is while it's pinned, I will take an X-Acto knife and cut a slit at the bottom of the seeds so that I can start to make that seam. But I'd like to also have my holes pre-cut for this, or pre-poked for this. I prefer not to have to pre-poke all my holes, or excuse me, to do all my holes while sort of free form. So I just have a small little triangle of foam core, and I place that behind. And then I'm going to again take my needle and just start poking holes where the seam is. So I kind of have to hold it towards me so that I can see. My eyes are going in my old age.
Do you ever poke?
Always. Not always. Not every single time, but definitely I poke my finger when, you know, you just get into that rhythm, and every, I don't know, 30 times it goes through the foam core and into my finger. I probably poke it more though when I'm actually sewing, just because sometimes the needle might not want to go all the way through the hole. So here, now I have it done on one side. You know, I used my little foam core triangle to get the holes on one side. So you can see, maybe, hopefully, you can see that there are holes along the seam where the seam will be. And instead of doing it again on this one, I just bring them together and pin them once again to my larger foam core. And just use the holes from the Duralar, the white piece, to poke through to the bottom piece. All right. So now it's prepped. And so the next step is going to be to create this seam or sew it so that it's ready to go. I don't know, I guess I'm trying to even think if you could do it after this part is all sewn, but I really don't think so. I think that would be really difficult to do. So we have some visitors. Hi. I'm doing a live stream, but you're welcome to come in and look at the work. I'm just sewing some seeds here. So this is a Sullivan, I think is the company I use. It's embroidery, I can never say that, embroidery floss. And it's 6-stranded, so I take one of the strands. And this is a super, super, super light blue. I think I went with that color because, as opposed to just plain white, because the Duralar and the Pictorico, which is, again, the material that's used for the photographs, have a slight blue tint to them. And so it made sense to me. I mean, it's so, like if you held it up to something white, you can barely tell that there's any blue in it anyway. All right, let's see if I can do this without licking it. I usually like to lick my thread, but I have a mask on. All right.
Bravo!
Did it. Okay, so then I just go ahead and I put together the seams. And I've gotten to the point where I know where to start. You do it enough times, it becomes kind of rote. All right, so that's the last hole for the seam. And as I tighten it, holds my seam in place. At one stage in making these or developing these seeds, I thought about just gluing the seam, and I tried it. And unfortunately, Duralar and Pictorico both do not love to be glued together and stay glued together. Because they're semi-translucent, they show the glue a little bit more. and they just don't stick. So I'd glue them for 24 hours and take the clip off, and they just come right apart. So using a material that I was already using anyway in the seeds, it made sense to work with thread. So I'm just basically locking off the line of thread so that it doesn't move. I don't really have a background in sewing at all. My aunt sewed, but I wasn't around her all that often because she didn't live in the same town. So she taught me a few things, but I've been mostly making it up as I go. It'd probably be good to know some more tricks of the trade. So now we've got dimension. So that's one side. Now we do the other side. Sometimes with the photograph, it's hard to see the holes. Okay, so that one too is done. I just cinch it up. And tie it off. And now we have two sides. And so the next step will simply be to start sewing the two sides together. And I like to start with a pretty long piece of thread. This one is not long enough. And I think what I will do for you today is get it close to the end. So you can see it start to come together. All right. Let's see if I'm successful the second time. Yay. All right, and then I start to sew. I usually start by coming through the photograph side, but I make sure I'm not on the same side as the text. There's no real specific reason for that, except for that's sort of the pattern that I've gotten into, and in part, I guess, so that the end of the thread, when I get to the point where I'm finished with it, isn't too close to the text. I just didn't want that to be a distraction. So go through where the photograph is, and then I make sure that I'm lined up with my dots. And usually by the second or third hole, I don't really have to pay as close attention anymore because it will just stay lined up. And it's basically in through the text side, out through the photo side, and then just wrap around and again in through the text side, out through the photo side to create that wraparound stitch. One of the other things I liked about this particular project was it's mobile, so I could do it just about anywhere. If I had the seeds pretty much cut into their shapes, I could poke them in the car. I could just put this on my lap and poke through the two sides. Obviously, can sew them in the car, on the couch. Sometimes watching a movie, especially if it's one I've seen before. And then this was my carrying box, basically. You see, it's just a shoe box that all my supplies would be in there, and I could just carry it around the house or on trips. when I get to this point, it can get a little tricky. First of all, there's no more holes because I didn't poke holes where the seam was going to be, since I didn't know how exactly those areas of the seed would match up. So I figured that's the one spot where I actually do the holes as I'm sewing. The other is sometimes this hole doesn't come all the way shut. So sometimes I actually just stop sewing here and then end up sewing another strip on the other side. Either of these are an example of that. Now, these are all pretty good seams. So what I do a lot of the times is stop here with the thread that I'm working on and don't tie off yet, because this is one where I should be able to sew all the way through, and then I'm going to sew through on the other side. So this time I want to match up the direction that the thread is going. And so I'm actually going to come through on the other side. So before I started my knot by going through the photo, this time I'm going to start my knot going through the text side at the same spot that I went through for the photo. So finding that hole and getting it can sometimes be a little tricky. Okay. So now I sew this other side. So I'm going to stop there for a sec because I have an opening that's a couple inches long, and one of the fun things about these seeds is some of them, not all of them, but a lot of them have little inside surprises. So these are kind of a throwback to past work that I've been doing in recent years, where I've got little figures, and I also have little insects. So I was very interested in the idea of collections and pinning specimens like insects in boxes. And so some of my work has plays with figures being pinned into drawers rather than insects. And the figures that I've chosen, again, I use the die cutter machine for these. They're all from medical illustrations, vintage medical illustrations. Vesalius was one of the more common artists that would make these medical illustrations. And so they're just little cutouts of those illustrations. And the insect ones are just from insects themselves. And so if it works out, I like to put little surprises into the seed packets. A couple of reasons. If you look up how seeds work, a lot of times it's a process that involves, a outer coating and then the inner embryo that's inside and comes out later when the seed coat either dissolves or spreads out and lets the embryo come out. But the other reason too is that I liked that they made sound. And so, unfortunately because of COVID, folks can't pick up the seeds and find out for themselves. But that was also part of the original idea of having a little surprise inside the seeds. So once that's in there, I can finish sewing up.
I've got a question for you.
Okay.
Would you ever consider putting like text or kind of letters inside? I know that you talk about it as memory in some of the texts that you write.
I actually did think about putting text. In fact, the text from these letters I've kept as much as I could. The letters are stenciled. I had to use a stencil so that it wouldn't cut all the way through the text or the letter. So I've kept all those little pieces. The reason I didn't do it on these is because, well, honestly, I think now that I look at them, no, it probably wouldn't have been okay. But so there's the holes that the text makes up, and then there's sort of the holes between the seams, and I was afraid the text would fall out. Already the needles will come through from the little specimens, which I kind of actually like it. I mentioned it to a friend, and she's like, well, nature can be dangerous, and so like if somebody picked it up and got poked, they're not going to have to go to the hospital, but it might make them say, ow, so yes, in answer to the question, have I thought about putting text in there? I also thought about the idea of more like a fortune cookie idea of putting it on a piece of paper and putting it in there, but then it felt too redundant with the text on the outside. So maybe down the road in a piece that's similar but doesn't necessarily use the text on the outside, instead using it more on the inside. Hopefully that answers the question. Okay. So now I'm kind of at that point where I have to start creating my own holes. And it can get kind of, what's the right word? I mean, not messy, but more frustrating, because the paper at this point, because it's got shape to it, and it's pretty tightly packed together from the sewing that I've done already. And if you remember before, I also said that the plastic isn't as easy to get through. It can be a little trickier. Also, at this portion of the seed, I'm going through 2 layers of plastic, not just one on each side. So if you heard that sound, I have no idea what it was. So just a few more holes to go.
How long did it take to make 300?
I started making these seeds, I think in January. Is that right? Maybe, no. I mean, the ideas were being developed last fall and winter, but I started, I think, making actual seeds that were in the show, late March. And my goal was to make 16 a week. And because I was also working on other aspects of the show and dealing with life and all that kind of fun stuff. But I was pretty good until the summer, and then in the summer I had a couple different scenarios where it went down to like 10 a week, and then I did well in August, and then back down to 10 a week in September, right before the show came up. So many months. As you can see, if you've been with me this whole time, how long a single seed takes, and I even jumped ahead a few steps from the beginning, where I import the photograph and then print it, cut the text, all that stuff. So they do each take quite a bit of time. So this is where, like, if I want to get in, oh my gosh, I'm sorry. We'll figure that out next time. That's actually connected to my son's phone, not mine. So I'll do one more. Any more questions? Okay, that should be the last. Bit. Now, what I like to do is just tighten it up a little. You know, it gets a little loose from when I'm sort of separating it out to make sure that all the holes get poked through. But hopefully you can see, I'm just sort of taking the needle and tightening the thread as I go along. This paper is pretty durable. I mean, the photograph itself will get scratched if it's handled too roughly, or if you literally take a needle across it. And then same with the Duralar, it's mostly pretty durable, except for if you bend it hard enough, it will kink. But I manipulate these quite a bit, and they hold up quite well. I think what suffered the most from handling is the text. I've noticed as we moved it around the gallery to give it a place to live, some of the text got beaten up from that, moving around. But a part of me, again, since they're seeds and they're supposed to sort of mimic process seeds go through, you know, they start to show wear over time. And so then I just tie off the two ends, and we've got a seed.
I'm wondering, it looks like you have two different types of Duralar or this transparent material. Is there a difference?
Sorry, say that again.
Is there a difference, or is it just age?
There are actually two different types of seeds. This is the main one I use, which I'll break down how it sort of my thought process as it developed with making these. So the Duralar and the Pictorico are work together. They're paired together in probably 2/3 of the seeds. And so that's the white is the Duralar, and then the Pictorico. The other material I use is for the text, it's mulberry paper, which is the same material that I've used on the weavings that are in the show, and also the encaustic wax pieces that are in the show. And like those, I've dipped the text side in, or I should say I've infused wax into this side of the paper, the text side. And then the photographic side is very similar to mulberry, but it's called Kozo, and it's an inkjet paper, so it's meant to have a photograph on it, but it's a much softer printout of an image than, say, if you did it on Pictorico. And mulberry paper is it's a very strong but lightweight paper, and so when you infuse it with wax, it starts to become also semi-transparent. So if I don't know if you can tell in the light here, but you can sort of start to see the red from the photograph looking through it. And what my thought pattern was as these developed was to have any of the natural images, any of the images of nature be on the plastic material, and then any of the sort of more man-made images to be on the mulberry, because it's more organic. So it was sort of an juxtaposition and opposing material and ideas together. These two man-made examples are sort of hard to see, but this is just cracks on a wall, like a cement wall. And this is a red children's ball at the beach with the fencing for a sand dune. And then the text, to kind of go along with that, the text often would be, like if it was with a natural shot, a nature scene, I would try and come up with a text that might be more human. Like, so for when I talked about architectural, different types of architecture and different parts in architecture and terms in architecture, that those would often be paired with scenes in the natural world. So those are the materials that were used, and I mentioned earlier the embroidery floss. And our seed is done. So I can add this one to my pile. So if there are no more questions, that's all I've got for you today. We'll be doing this again in 2 weeks, and probably what I'll do is mostly just sew, unless I hear from any of you that there's something else that you're interested in knowing more about or seeing more of. You can always contact me through the Duluth Art Institute or my own website, which I believe is posted right now on the screen. So thank you, everybody, for joining me, and good luck relaxing today on voting day. Okay, thank you.